The Shadow Archive. Hidden Facts Behind Famous Events. Chapter 1. The Envelope. On a freezing January morning in Washington, D.C., investigative journalist Ethan Cole arrived early at his newsroom office. The city outside was quiet, wrapped in pale winter light. From his window, he could see the distant silhouette of the Capitol dome, a reminder that power in America was often loud in public, but silent in private. On his desk sat an envelope that hadn't been there the night before. No return address, no postage, just his name, Ethan Cole, typed in stark black letters. Inside was a single photograph. It showed President John F. Kennedy moments before his motorcade in Dallas on November 22, 1963. The image looked familiar, archival, widely published, almost iconic, but someone had circled a figure in the background. A man in a gray suit, standing still, watching. Ethan leaned closer. The face was grainy but distinct, calm, observant, detached from the chaos that history would soon unleash. On the back of the photograph were 3 typed words: "Find the archive." Ethan wasn't new to secrets. He had built his career exposing defense overspending near Arlington, tracing shell corporations in Manhattan, and uncovering quiet expansions of federal surveillance programs after the September 11th attacks. But this felt different. This wasn't a leak. It was an invitation. He scanned the image into his system and ran facial recognition software against public historical databases. 3 minutes later, his heartbeat slowed. The same face appeared again. A 1968 crowd shot outside the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. A 1974 congressional hearing broadcast. A 1986 Cold War summit photo. A 1987 trading floor image from New York City during Black Monday. And impossibly, a blurred still from Lower Manhattan on September 11, 2001. The man didn't age, not noticeably. Ethan zoomed further into the Dallas image. The angle suggested the photograph had been taken seconds before the fatal shot that would change America forever. The official investigations had combed through thousands of images, interviews, testimonies. The Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, independent commissions, every angle dissected for decades. So how had this man never been identified? Or had he? Ethan dove into declassified files, focusing not on suspects, but on observers. He searched for intelligence operatives present at major historical flashpoints. He cross-referenced staff lists, temporary field agents, contract analysts. Hours blurred into night. Finally, buried in a partially redacted 1974 memo, he found a name: Daniel Halbrook. Title: Archivist. Security briefings. At every turning point of modern American history, the same man, always present, never central, never acknowledged. Ethan felt a strange chill. This wasn't about orchestrating events. There was no evidence Halbrook caused anything. He simply appeared, like a historian standing too close to the page while it was still being written. Late one night, Ethan received another message, this time encrypted. A single sentence: "You're looking at the wrong question." Attached was a document fragment stamped with a federal classification header long expired. Operation Lantern. Objective: narrative stabilization. The language was careful, almost philosophical. In moments of national trauma, uncontrolled dissemination of raw intelligence may produce destabilizing social effects. Strategic sequencing of information preserves institutional continuity. Strategic sequencing. Not fabrication, not erasure, sequencing. Ethan leaned back in his chair. What if the hidden facts behind famous events weren't about secret masterminds pulling strings? What if they were about timing? What if there existed a quiet office somewhere beneath layers of bureaucracy where information was stored, organized, and released when the nation was ready? Not to lie, but to prevent panic. And Daniel Hallbrook, the archivist, was its keeper. As snow began to fall outside Ethan's window, he printed the Dallas photograph again and pinned it to his corkboard. The gray-suited man stared outward, calm amid chaos. Ethan whispered to the empty room, "What are you protecting?" His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. A steady voice spoke on the other end. "You found the name," the man said. "That means you're ready for the next step." "Who is this?" Ethan demanded. A pause. "You're asking about hidden facts behind famous events, but the real story isn't what happened. It's what almost did." Click. The line went dead. Ethan stared at the city lights flickering beyond the Potomac. For the first time in his career, he wasn't chasing corruption. He was chasing something far more unsettling. The possibility that history itself had a guardian, and that guardian had just noticed him.
Chapter 2. Operation Lantern. Ethan didn't sleep. The voice on the phone replayed in his mind all night. It's not what happened, it's what almost did. By dawn, he was back in his office in Washington, D.C., coffee untouched, screens glowing with declassified documents and archived broadcasts. If Daniel Hallbrook was real and not some elaborate fabrication, there had to be more traces. He shifted his focus from assassinations and attacks to something subtler. Moments when disaster was narrowly avoided. Moments the public barely noticed. The first anomaly appeared in October 1962, during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, while President John F. Kennedy negotiated with Soviet leadership. The world stood on the edge of nuclear war. The official history describes tense diplomacy, back-channel negotiations, and a peaceful resolution. But buried in a recently digitized National Archives folder, Ethan found a footnote referencing an internal advisory group labeled Continuity Review, Lantern Division. Lantern again. The document suggested a secondary communication team prepared alternative public statements in case negotiations failed. 3 versions of history, pre-written: immediate retaliation, defensive containment, diplomatic breakthrough. Each speech crafted not just to inform, but to emotionally calibrate the nation. Ethan leaned back. This wasn't about manipulating events. It was about preparing the emotional aftermath. He expanded his search to 1969. When Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon during Apollo 11, the United States felt invincible. But Ethan uncovered a contingency memo from NASA titled Presidential Address in Event of Lunar Casualty. The speech, written in advance, assumed Armstrong and Aldrin might die on the surface. What startled Ethan wasn't the existence of the speech, that was known. It was a margin note in different handwriting,
lantern clearance required before broadcast. Why would a space tragedy require clearance from a narrative stabilization unit? Unless Lantern's purpose was to choreograph not just what happened, but how America processed it. Ethan's next lead came from 1983, a near-launch nuclear alert triggered by a satellite malfunction. The event never became public knowledge in real time. Only decades later did historians reveal how close the world came to catastrophe. Ethan tracked down a retired Air Force communications officer in Colorado Springs. The officer, now in his 70s, agreed to meet under one condition: no recording devices. They met at a quiet diner off Interstate 25. There was a team, the officer admitted. Civilians, not military. They showed up during high-risk events. "Did you know their purpose?" Ethan asked. "Officially, no. Unofficially, they monitored reaction models." Reaction models? How markets would respond, how foreign governments would respond, how civilians would respond if certain truths were released instantly. And if the reaction was destabilizing? The officer stirred his coffee. Then the truth waited. Back in Washington, Ethan mapped a pattern. 1962, nuclear brinksmanship. 1969, lunar uncertainty. 1983, false alarm. 1987, market crash. 2001, terror attacks. 2008, financial collapse. Every time America stood near systemic breakdown, lantern activity increased. And in multiple background images from those eras, Daniel Halebrook, always observing, always still. Ethan finally gained access to a restricted reading room after filing a Freedom of Information appeal related to Cold War contingency planning. Most of the files were dull, bureaucratic language, redundant protocols, until he found a slim, unindexed binder labeled simply Archive Transfer Procedures. Inside was a short mission statement. The Shadow Archive preserves unfiltered historical data during periods of national volatility. Release is determined by stabilization metrics, not political cycles. Unfiltered data, preserved, delayed, not destroyed. Ethan felt the weight of that distinction. This wasn't censorship in the traditional sense. It was buffering, a shock absorber for democracy. That night, as he walked past the illuminated monuments of the National Mall, Ethan wrestled with a troubling realization. What if Operation Lantern prevented greater chaos? What if immediate transparency during the Cuban Missile Crisis had triggered panic buying, bank runs, even riots? What if broadcasting unverified intelligence during the early hours of the September 11th attacks could have collapsed financial systems before rescue operations stabilized the situation? Was delayed truth a betrayal or a safeguard? His phone vibrated again. Unknown number. "You're connecting the right dots," the same calm voice said. Ethan replied. Halebrook, quietly. A faint chuckle. Names are convenient. Roles are permanent. What is the Shadow Archive? A library of moments that almost broke the country. Why tell me any of this? A pause. Because we're approaching another one. The line went silent. Ethan stopped walking. Around him, tourists took photos, children laughed, traffic hummed. Ordinary life, fragile yet steady. If the archive truly existed, if Lantern truly operated beyond party lines and presidencies, then it had shaped not just outcomes, but emotional trajectories of the American people for generations. And now, according to the archivist, another inflection point was coming. For the first time, Ethan understood the deeper hidden fact behind famous events. History isn't just recorded, it's timed. And someone, somewhere, was still deciding when America was ready for the next truth. Chapter 3. The Market Before the Storm. Ethan returned to his office with a growing sense that he was no longer investigating the past. He was being prepared for the future. The archivist's warning echoed in his mind. Another inflection point was coming. If Operation Lantern had activated during moments of national instability, then the next logical place to look was the modern financial system, where panic could spread faster than any missile. He began reviewing the events leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, focusing on the quiet weeks before the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Publicly, the crisis appeared sudden, markets plunging, credit freezing, fear radiating from Wall Street to Main Street. But internal Federal Reserve transcripts, released years later, revealed something else. Certain policymakers had known the structural weaknesses months in advance. What Ethan discovered was not evidence of deliberate collapse, but of calculated containment. In a series of emergency meetings in New York City and Washington, stabilization teams modeled public reaction scenarios. One memo referenced lantern advisory thresholds. The wording was careful. Immediate disclosure of liquidity instability may accelerate depositor panic beyond recoverable parameters. In other words, if Americans understood how fragile the banking system truly was at that moment, they might have triggered the very collapse leaders were trying to prevent. Ethan traced the memo's distribution list and found a familiar, nearly invisible signature: D. Halbrook, Continuity Review. The archivist hadn't caused the crash. He had evaluated when the nation could handle the full scope of it. Ethan dug deeper into archived footage from September 15, 2008. Amid the frantic reporters outside Lehman's headquarters, he spotted him again, a gray-suited figure standing calmly behind the barricades, not speaking, not gesturing, simply observing. The same posture as Dallas, the same stillness as during September 11th attacks, a witness to rupture. But the deeper Ethan went, the more unsettling the pattern became. Lantern's involvement didn't align with party politics. It didn't favor conservatives or liberals, hawks or doves. It activated when volatility metrics spiked, when trust itself was in danger. A classified academic partnership in Boston revealed that Lantern collaborated with behavioral economists to model fear contagion. They studied how rumors spread faster than facts, how markets responded not just to data, but to emotion. Ethan read a chilling line in one behavioral assessment. Democratic societies are strongest when informed, but most vulnerable when shocked. Shock was the enemy, not truth, not freedom, shock. The shadow archive, he began to understand, was less a vault of secrets and more a pressure valve. Raw intelligence, unverified reports, conflicting analyses, worst-case projections was stored until the social temperature cooled. Released too early, and institutions could fracture. Released too late, and trust could erode. The archivist's role was to balance that razor's edge. One evening, Ethan received access to a secure digital drop containing predictive models labeled 2020 to 2035 risk horizons. The files referenced climate migration stress, AI-driven labor displacement, and cyber vulnerabilities in electoral infrastructure. He noticed references to NASA climate data integrations and Department of Energy grid simulations. None of it suggested conspiracy, only fragility. America's systems were vast, interconnected, and sensitive to sudden surges of fear. Then he found a transcript of a private policy roundtable from 2016 discussing misinformation during the presidential election. Though no political figures were named directly, the discussion centered on protecting democratic continuity during periods of algorithmic manipulation. Lantern's involvement was again advisory. Controlled disclosure sequencing recommended to prevent cascading delegitimization. Ethan felt the weight of those words, cascading delegitimization. If citizens lost faith in elections overnight without context, the damage could outpace any corrective evidence. The archivist wasn't hiding election results. He was evaluating how to prevent informational wildfire. Still, Ethan struggled with the ethical tension. Who decided when Americans were ready? Who measured stabilization metrics? And what if those metrics were wrong? Late one night, his office flickered as a storm rolled across the Capitol. His encrypted phone buzzed. "You're starting to see the architecture," Halbrook's calm voice said. "Architecture implies design. It implies responsibility," Ethan replied. "It implies responsibility. Every generation inherits unfinished risk. We do not design history. We reduce the blast radius when it detonates." "And who elected you?" Ethan pressed. Silence lingered before the archivist responded. "No one elects gravity either, yet engineers still build shock absorbers." The call ended. Ethan stared at the city skyline, rain streaking against the glass. If Lantern was a shock absorber, then America had been riding on buffered truth for decades. But shocks were growing stronger in the digital age. Social media accelerated outrage. Markets reacted in milliseconds. Rumors could destabilize alliances before sunrise. The next inflection point, Halbrook had warned, was approaching. And for the first time, Ethan considered the possibility that the hidden facts behind famous events were not about villains orchestrating chaos, but about quiet custodians calculating how much truth a free society could absorb without tearing itself apart.
Chapter 4. The Release. The storm over Washington had passed by morning, but the air felt charged, as if the city itself sensed pressure building beneath its marble monuments. Ethan hadn't left his office. The predictive files labeled 2020 to 2035 risk horizons replayed in his mind. Climate displacement curves, AI labor shock projections, cyber attack simulations targeting electoral grids. None of it was theatrical. None of it was cinematic. It was worse. It was plausible. He realized the archivist's warning wasn't about a single catastrophic event. It was about convergence. Economic strain, digital misinformation, environmental disruption, individually survivable, collectively destabilizing. And somewhere inside the federal labyrinth of Washington, the Shadow Archive was updating its stabilization metrics in real time. Ethan made a decision. Instead of publishing a sensational exposé accusing unnamed agencies of manipulating history, he began drafting something different, an investigative series about timed transparency in democratic systems. He cited historical examples, the delayed release of Cold War near-miss incidents, the phased disclosure of intelligence following the September 11th attacks, the structured communication strategies surrounding the collapse of Lehman Brothers. He avoided speculation. He focused on documented patterns. On the third night of writing, he received an encrypted package containing one final document. It was labeled 2032 Contingency, Public Trust Threshold. Inside were simulation results projecting what would happen if multiple crises peaked simultaneously. A contested national election, a coordinated cyber attack on regional power grids, and a climate-driven migration surge overwhelming southern infrastructure. The simulations showed two outcomes. In Scenario A, immediate full-spectrum disclosure of raw intelligence triggered market freefall, supply chain hoarding, and localized unrest. In Scenario B, sequenced disclosure paired with institutional coordination reduced panic and maintained order long enough for stabilization measures to take effect. The margin note was in Halbrook's steady handwriting. Democracy survives shock when truth is structured, not suppressed. Ethan felt the moral weight settle over him. Absolute transparency sounded noble, but if unfiltered data triggered collapse before solutions could be implemented, was it responsible? Yet secrecy without accountability eroded trust just as surely. The balance was razor thin. He requested a meeting through the encrypted channel. This time, the archivist agreed. They met beneath a nondescript federal building near the heart of Washington.
No dramatic security theater, just biometric doors and quiet hallways humming with climate control. Halbrook appeared exactly as before, gray suit, steady gaze, ageless composure. "You're not villains, but you're not elected either. We are audited," Halbrook replied calmly, "by rotating bipartisan oversight committees, federal judges, and independent analysts. The archive does not erase, it delays." He led Ethan into a vast subterranean chamber lined with temperature-controlled vaults. Shelves held sealed files tied to decades of American inflection points, assassinations, financial crashes, diplomatic brinksmanship, cyber intrusions. "Every document here will be released, but not all at once. Nations fracture when overloaded." Ethan walked slowly through the aisles. He realized the hidden fact behind famous events wasn't orchestration, it was containment. Not control of outcomes, but control of timing. "Another inflection point is coming, isn't it?" Ethan asked. Halbrook nodded. "The digital age compresses reaction time. Outrage spreads in seconds. Markets respond in milliseconds. We are reaching the limits of buffering." "So what happens when the shock absorber fails?" Halbrook met his eyes. "Then transparency must mature as fast as technology. Citizens must learn to process complexity without collapsing into fear." Ethan understood then. The archive's greatest vulnerability wasn't exposure, it was irrelevance. If Americans demanded instant, context-free revelation of every fragment of intelligence, Lantern's sequencing model would collapse. But if institutions overreached and withheld too long, trust would dissolve. The system depended on a fragile social contract. Ethan returned to his newsroom and published his series under a bold headline, "The Age of Timed Truth." He revealed the existence of continuity review mechanisms without exposing sensitive locations or personnel. He framed it as a national debate rather than an accusation. The reaction was immediate. Universities hosted forums, constitutional scholars argued on live television, veterans called into radio shows, economists published op-eds. Some citizens demanded dismantling any unelected narrative review structure. Others acknowledged the danger of informational shock in a hyper-connected society. For weeks, America argued, not in riot, but in discourse. Trust did not collapse. It recalibrated. Ethan never received another anonymous envelope, but months later, while covering a global climate summit in San Francisco, he spotted a familiar gray figure at the edge of the crowd. Daniel Halbrook stood quietly, observing delegates as they negotiated emissions thresholds and infrastructure funding. Not directing, not intervening, witnessing. Ethan didn't need to approach him. He didn't need to. The archivist's role was clear now. The Shadow Archive was not a puppet master of American history. It was a vault of deferred context, a pressure valve built to prevent democratic rupture during moments of extreme volatility. The hidden facts behind famous events were not secret villains or cinematic conspiracies. They were the near misses, the almost collapses, the disasters narrowly avoided, and the emotional aftershocks carefully managed. History, Ethan realized, was not just a record of what happened, it was a sequence of survivals. And in the quiet spaces between chaos and comprehension, someone had always been measuring how much truth the nation could bear at once. The future would test that balance more than ever, but for now, the experiment held. Democracy endured, not because it was shielded from truth, but because it learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to receive it without breaking.